They called him crazy for spending his last $3,000 on a crumbling monastery buried in snow. But when David opened a hidden vault beneath those ancient stone floors, what he found inside was worth $277 million and would silence every person who had ever doubted him. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The snow had been falling for 3 straight days, turning the small town of Cedar Falls into a picture postcard that David Martinez no longer had the heart to appreciate. He sat in his rusted pickup truck outside Henderson's Hardware, watching through frost-covered windows as the owner swept slush from his front steps. The engine ticked as it cooled, each sound a reminder of another repair he couldn't afford. David pulled the crumpled auction notice from his coat pocket for the 100th time that week. The paper was worn soft. From handling, the ink smudged where his thumb had traced the words over and over. St. Augustine's Monastery and Grounds, minimum bid $3,000. Auction to be held December 15th at 10 a.m. sharp, $3,000. It might as well have been $3 million. The passenger door creaked open, and his oldest daughter Emma slid in, shivering as she pulled her too thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. At 16, she had their mother's gentle eyes and stubborn chin, but lately those eyes carried a weight no teenager should bear. "Dad?" Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Mrs. Patterson said you missed work again yesterday." David closed his eyes. Emma worked part-time at Patterson's grocery after school, stocking shelves and bagging groceries to help with bills that never seemed to get smaller. She shouldn't know about his missed shifts at the lumber mill, shouldn't have to worry about whether they'd make rent this month. "I had some things to take care of," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie. He'd spent yesterday sitting in the cemetery, talking to Sarah's headstone about decisions he didn't know how to make. "Dad, people are talking." Emma's voice was small, careful. "They're saying you've been acting strange since Mom died. And now this thing about the monastery." David's jaw tightened. The town had been whispering about him for months, ever since Sarah lost her battle with cancer 8 months ago. The whispers had gotten louder last week, when he'd been seen at the courthouse, asking questions about the auction. "What are they saying?" Emma bit her lip, a habit she'd inherited from her mother. "Mrs. Henderson said you inquired about bidding on that old place up on Monastery Hill. She thinks the grief has made you lose your mind." "Maybe it has," David muttered, starting the truck. The engine coughed twice before catching, another reminder of problems he couldn't solve. They drove home in silence, through streets lined with modest houses, each one warm and bright with families who still believed the world made sense. David's own house sat at the end of Maple Street, a small ranch with peeling paint and a front step that sagged under the weight of too many winters. The twins, Marcus and Samuel, were visible through the living room window, 8 years old, and sprawled on the carpet, doing homework by the light of a table lamp because the overhead fixture had burned out weeks ago. Inside, the house smelled like the chicken soup Emma had learned to make from a can, stretched with rice to feed 4 people. The boys looked up when David walked in, their faces brightening in a way that made his chest ache. "Dad," Marcus jumped up, waving a math worksheet. "I got all the hard problems right." "Me too," Samuel chimed in, not to be outdone by his twin. "Mrs. Garcia said I might be ready for advanced math next year." David forced a smile and ruffled their hair. These beautiful boys who still believed their father could fix anything. They didn't know about the past due notices hidden in his dresser drawer. They didn't know their health insurance had lapsed, or that he'd been eating lunch every other day so there would be enough food for dinner. "That's great, guys. I'm proud of you both." Emma busied herself in the kitchen, but David could feel her watching him, measuring his mood like she'd learned to do since Sarah died. She'd grown up too fast. This girl who should be worried about boys and college applications instead of whether her father was falling apart. After the boys went to bed, David sat at the kitchen table with the auction notice spread in front of him. Emma curled up in the chair across from him, homework forgotten. "Dad, why the monastery? Of all the places in the world, Why, that one. David looked up at his daughter, at the worry lines that had appeared around her eyes since her mother's funeral. How could he explain it? How could he tell her that driving past that crumbling building every day on his way to work felt like drowning? That seeing it empty and forgotten reminded him of how hollow he felt inside. Your mom loved that place, he said finally. When we were young, before you kids were born, she used to drag me up there for picnics. Said it felt peaceful, like a place where broken things could be made whole again. Emma's eyes softened. She never told me that. It was our secret spot. The monks had been gone for years even then, but the building was still beautiful. The stained glass windows, the stone archways, the way the light fell across the altar in the afternoon. David's voice caught. She said someday, when we had money, we should buy it and turn it into something special. A place for families, for community events, he trailed off, remembering Sarah's laugh as she spun around in the empty nave, arms outstretched, dreaming out loud about all the possibilities. She'd been 22 then, full of hope and plans they'd never get to fulfill. Dad. Emma reached across the table and touched his hand. We don't have $3,000, I know. The boys need winter coats. The electricity bill is overdue, Mom's medical bills. She gestured at the stack of envelopes on the counter, each one stamped with urgent notices and final demands. I know, David repeated, but his eyes drifted back to the auction notice. But sometimes, sometimes you have to believe that things will work out. What if they don't? It was the question that kept him awake at night, the fear that gnawed at him every time he looked at his children's trusting faces. What if the lumber mill laid him off? What if they lost the house? What if he failed them the way he'd failed to save their mother? Then we'll figure it out together, he said, words that felt like a prayer. We always do. The next morning brought fresh snow and fresh gossip. David could feel the stares as he walked into Murphy's diner for coffee, could hear the whispers that died when he approached the counter. Heard you're thinking about buying the old monastery, said Bill Murphy, sliding a steaming cup across the scarred formica. His tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes held the same pity David had been seeing everywhere lately. Maybe, David replied, wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. That's a lot of money for a place that's been falling down for 40 years. Bill leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. Dave, I know you're still hurting over Sarah. We all are, but throwing away your savings on a pipe dream. It's not a pipe dream. What is it then? You planning to live up there? Turn it into a bed and breakfast? Bill's laugh was gentle but patronizing. Come on, man. That place has been abandoned since the 70s. The roof leaks, the heating system shot, and God knows what kind of damage the weather's done to the foundation. Around the diner, conversations had quieted. David could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on him, measuring, judging, finding him wanting. These were people he'd known his whole life, people who'd brought casseroles after Sarah's funeral and promised to help if he ever needed anything. But help, apparently, didn't include supporting decisions they couldn't understand. Sarah always said it had potential, David said quietly. Bill's expression softened. Sarah was a dreamer, God rest her soul, but you've got 3 kids to think about now. Practical things, real things. David set down his coffee cup, suddenly unable to stomach the taste. Thanks for the advice, Bill. He left $1 on the counter and walked out, hearing the buzz of conversation resume before the door had even closed behind him. Outside, the cold air bit at his cheeks as he climbed back into his truck. The drive to work took him past the monastery, as it always did. David slowed as he crested the hill, looking up at the massive Gothic structure that dominated the landscape. Even covered in snow and ice, even with broken windows and crumbling mortar, it was magnificent. The bell tower reached toward the gray sky like a finger pointing to heaven, and the flying buttresses gave the whole building a sense of movement, as if it might take flight at any moment. He pulled into the small parking area at the bottom of the hill and sat staring up at the building. This was where he and Sarah had come on their first real date. 15 years ago. She'd packed a picnic basket and insisted they explore the abandoned monastery, laughing as they climbed through broken windows and imagined what the place must have been like when it was alive with prayer and purpose. "It's not really abandoned," she'd said, running her hand along the smooth stone of the altar. "It's just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up." David pulled out his phone and called the number on the auction notice. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "County Clerk's office. This is Jerry. Hi, I'm calling about the Monastery auction tomorrow. I wanted to confirm the minimum bid, $3,000, cash or certified check. You planning to bid?" David closed his eyes. "Maybe. Well, you might be the only one. Been advertising that sale for 6 weeks, and you're the first person to call. Most folks think the place is more trouble than it's worth." After David hung up, he sat in the truck watching snow fall on the monastery's ancient stones. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe grief had scrambled his judgment, made him cling to dreams that had died with his wife. But as he stared up at those towering walls, he could hear Sarah's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "It's not about the money, David. It's about faith. Faith that broken things can be beautiful again." The auction was held in the courthouse basement, a cramped room that smelled of coffee and disappointment. David arrived early, his savings account emptied and converted to a cashier's check that represented everything he had left in the world, $3,047 to be exact. Not enough to fix their problems, but maybe enough to honor his wife's memory. He wasn't surprised to find himself alone, except for the auctioneer, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit who seemed annoyed to be there at all. "Guess it's just you and the county today," the man said, shuffling papers on a folding table. "This is probably the easiest auction I've run in 20 years. No one else is coming?" "Nope, can't say I blame them. That place needs more work than most people want to tackle." The auctioneer looked at David with curiosity. "You sure you know what you're getting into?" David thought about Emma's worried eyes, about the boys who needed winter coats, about the stack of medical bills that would follow them for years. "No," he admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The actual auction took less than 5 minutes. The auctioneer's voice echoed in the empty room as he went through the legal formalities, but it felt like a ceremony rather than a transaction. When the gavel fell, David owned 43 acres of hilltop property and one crumbling monastery that everyone else considered worthless. Driving up to the monastery as its legal owner felt different somehow. David parked in front of the massive oak doors and sat for a moment, keys heavy in his palm. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the entrance, and the lock turned easier than he'd expected, as if the building had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was cold but not bitter, filled with the scent of old wood and stone that had absorbed decades of silence. Pale light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the floor. The wooden pews were still arranged in perfect rows, though covered in dust and debris. Everything was exactly as he remembered from those stolen afternoons with Sarah, except now it belonged to him. What happens next will reveal secrets that have been hidden for over a century, transform a grieving man's desperate gamble into the discovery of a lifetime, and prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are found by those brave enough to trust their hearts over their heads. If you're enjoying this incredible story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. David walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing off the vaulted ceiling. At the altar, he stopped and looked up at the massive crucifix suspended above everything, its arms reaching out like an embrace. This was where he and Sarah had stood all those years ago, where she'd spun in circles with her arms outstretched, laughing about all the possibilities. Now those possibilities felt like burdens. What was he supposed to do with this place? He didn't have money to restore it, didn't have skills to repair centuries of neglect. He'd bought it on faith and memory, but faith didn't fix leaking roofs or replace broken windows. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson needs to know if you can work a double shift tomorrow. We really need the money." David closed his eyes. What had he done? Emma was right to worry, right to question his judgment. He'd spent their future on a building that would probably cost more to demolish than to repair. The townspeople were right to call him crazy. But as he stood in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed centuries of prayer and hope, something made him stay. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's laugh echoing in these halls. Maybe it was the way the light fell across the altar, just like it had 15 years ago. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he couldn't name but could feel in the ancient stones beneath his feet. David began to explore the building systematically, moving from room to room, making mental notes of everything that needed attention. The nave was in surprisingly good condition, though the roof had leaked in several places. The bell tower was accessible through a narrow stone staircase, though he didn't trust the wooden steps enough to climb all the way up. In the back of the building, he found what had once been the monastery's living quarters. Small cells lined a long corridor, each one barely large enough for a bed and a prayer desk. Most were empty, except for debris, but one still contained a wooden cot and a shelf lined with books, whose pages had long since turned to powder. It was in the last cell, the one closest to the main chapel, that David noticed something odd. The room was identical to all the others except for one detail: the back wall didn't quite match the others. The stones were the same, the mortar appeared identical, but something about the proportions seemed wrong. David ran his hands along the wall, feeling for irregularities. There, near the corner where the wall met the floor, his fingers found a seam that didn't belong. It was almost invisible, hidden by shadow and age, but definitely there. He pressed against the stone and felt it give slightly, as if it were loose. Heart racing, David went back to his truck and retrieved the toolbox he always carried for emergencies at the lumber mill. Using a small pry bar, he carefully worked at the loose stone until it shifted enough for him to grip its edges. With a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the empty monastery, the stone came free. Behind it was darkness and the faint sound of moving air. A passage. David grabbed his phone's flashlight and peered into the opening. Beyond the hole was a narrow corridor, cut directly into the bedrock beneath the monastery. The walls were smooth, worn by countless hands over unknown years. The passage sloped downward, disappearing into shadow that his phone's light couldn't penetrate. For a moment, David hesitated. This felt bigger than exploring an old building, bigger than satisfying curiosity. This felt like the moment in every ghost story where the hero made the choice that changed everything. But he'd already made his choice when he'd spent his last $3,000 on a dream. What was one more leap of faith? David squeezed through the opening and began to make his way down the passage. The air grew cooler as he descended, carrying scents that spoke of age and secrets. The walls on either side showed tool marks, evidence that this tunnel had been carved by human hands with infinite patience and purpose. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes, the passage opened into a larger space. David's flashlight beam swept across what appeared to be a circular chamber, about 20 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow. But it wasn't empty. Along the walls stood rows of wooden chests, each one bound with iron and locked with mechanisms that looked centuries old. In the center of the room sat a stone table, and on that table lay a leather-bound book. David approached the book with trembling hands. The cover was embossed with Latin text he couldn't read, but when he opened it, he found pages covered in careful English script. At the top of the first page, someone had written, "The Treasury of St. Augustine's Monastery, hidden by Brother Marcus in the year of our Lord 1873. David's breath caught in his throat as he read further. The book was an inventory, each page documenting the contents of the chests around him. Gold coins from the California gold rush. Jewelry donated by wealthy families. Religious artifacts of incalculable value. Rare manuscripts and illuminated texts, page after page, detailed a treasure that defied belief. According to the careful records, wealthy Catholics from across the region had donated their most precious possessions to the monastery in the years following the Civil War, believing their gifts would be used for God's work. But as David read deeper, he learned that the donations had been hidden away, as political tensions rose, then forgotten as the original monks died and were replaced by men who had no knowledge of the secret treasury. At the bottom of the final page, written in a shakier hand, was a note that made David's heart race. Total estimated value as of this date, $18,300,000. May God preserve these gifts for those who truly need them. $18 million. David sank to his knees beside the stone table, his mind struggling to process what he'd discovered. This wasn't just valuable, this was life-changing wealth, the kind of money that could solve every problem his family faced, and thousands more besides. With hands that shook from more than cold, David approached the nearest chest. The lock was old but solid, secured with a mechanism that had protected its contents for over a century. He'd need tools to open it properly, but even without seeing inside, he knew the inventory was accurate. This place felt sacred, protected, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Someone like him. David looked around the circular chamber, at the rows of chests that held more wealth than he could imagine, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. The grief that had nearly broken him, the town's mockery of his foolish purchase, the faith he'd inherited from his wife, that broken things could be made beautiful again. Sarah had been right about the monastery. It wasn't abandoned. It had been sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up, waiting for someone who needed not just treasure, but purpose. Someone who would understand that the greatest discoveries come not from seeking wealth, but from seeking meaning. As David climbed back through the passage toward the world above, his mind was already racing with possibilities. This wasn't just his good fortune. This was a responsibility, a trust that had been hidden for over a century and now rested in his calloused, uncertain hands. The people who had called him crazy for buying a crumbling monastery would soon learn that sometimes what looks like foolishness is actually faith taking its first brave step toward a miracle. The snow was still falling when David emerged from the monastery, but the world looked different now. The same gray sky, the same empty hills, but everything had changed. He was no longer the broken widower who had gambled his family's future on a desperate dream. He was the guardian of a secret that could transform not just his life, but the life of everyone around him. The drive home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls felt surreal. David gripped the steering wheel with hands that had just touched treasure beyond imagining, past houses where people were watching the news or helping children with homework, completely unaware that their neighbor had just discovered enough wealth to buy their entire town twice over. As he pulled into his driveway, David saw Emma through the kitchen window, helping the twins with their math homework at the table where Sarah used to sit. The sight filled him with an emotion so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. His children would never want for anything again. They would go to any college they chose, live in any house they dreamed of, have every opportunity he'd thought was lost forever. But more than that, he now had the means to honor Sarah's memory in ways he'd never imagined possible. The woman who had believed the monastery could be a place where broken things were made whole would finally see her vision become reality. David sat in his truck for a moment longer, letting the magnitude of his discovery settle into his bones. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, he was still just a father coming home to children who trusted him to somehow make their world safe again. He had no idea how right they were to trust him. David returned to the monastery before dawn the next morning, his heart pounding with anticipation and disbelief. The inventory book felt heavy in his coat pocket, its leather binding worn smooth from a century of careful handling. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Was what he'd found real? Could the treasure described in those yellowed pages actually exist, hidden beneath the monastery's ancient stones for over 100 years? The early morning air bit at his cheeks as he unlocked the massive oak doors. Inside, the monastery felt different now, charged with possibility and secrets that were finally ready to be revealed. David made his way back to the small cell where he'd discovered the loose stone, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that had witnessed centuries of prayer and devotion. The opening he'd created the day before gaped like a mouth in the stone wall, dark and inviting. David had brought proper equipment this time, a heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, and tools from his truck in case he needed to widen the passage. But first, he wanted to examine the opening more carefully in the light of day. Kneeling beside the hole, David ran his fingers along its edges. The stonework was masterful, each block fitted so precisely that the seam was nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. This wasn't a crack caused by age or settling. This was a deliberate construction, designed to be opened and closed by someone who knew the secret. David squeezed through the opening and began his descent into the passage below. The narrow corridor stretched before him, carved directly from the bedrock with the same precision as the concealed entrance above. The walls bore tool marks that spoke of infinite patience and skill, evidence that whoever had created this passage had taken months, perhaps years, to complete their work. As he moved deeper underground, the air grew cooler and carried scents that seemed to whisper of age and hidden things. The passage sloped steadily downward, leading him beneath the monastery's foundations and into the heart of the hill itself. Every step took him further from the world he knew and deeper into a mystery that had waited more than a century to be solved. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the narrow passage opened into a larger space. David's flashlight beam swept across a circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. But it was what filled the chamber that made his breath catch in his throat. Rows of wooden chests lined the curved walls, each one bound with iron straps and secured with locks that gleamed despite their age. The chests were arranged with military precision, numbered with brass plates that caught the light like tiny suns. In the center of the chamber stood a stone table, and on that table lay the leather-bound ledger he'd discovered the day before. But now, in the steady beam of his flashlight, David could see details that had escaped him in his initial shock. The chamber wasn't just a storage room, it was a sanctuary, a place designed to protect and preserve treasures beyond imagination. The walls were covered with religious symbols, carved deep into the stone, and the domed ceiling bore traces of what might once have been painted frescoes. David approached the first chest with trembling hands. According to the inventory, this one contained gold coins, donated by the Morrison family in 1874, payment for prayers for their son who had died in the Civil War. The lock was substantial, but showed signs of careful maintenance, as if someone had tended it regularly over the decades. Using a heavy pry bar he'd brought from his truck, David carefully worked at the ancient mechanism. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a satisfying click that seemed to echo through the chamber like a gunshot. With reverent hands, he lifted the heavy lid. What lay inside defied every expectation he might have had. Nestled in beds of faded velvet were hundreds of gold coins, each one gleaming as if it had been minted yesterday. David picked up a single coin, feeling its weight in his palm. The date read 1871, and the gold was so pure it seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. According to the inventory, this single chest contained over 800 gold coins, each one worth far more than its face value due to rarity and historical significance. David's hands shook as he carefully replaced the coin and closed the chest. If the inventory was accurate, this one container held enough wealth to solve every financial problem his family faced. But this was only the beginning. David moved to the second chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The inventory described this one as containing jewelry donated by the Ashford family. Pieces that had been in their family for generations before being given to the monastery in 1875. The lock opened more easily this time, as if recognizing his authority to disturb its long vigil. Inside was a collection that belonged in a palace. Necklaces dripping with diamonds caught the light like captured stars. Emerald earrings, the size of his thumbnails, rested beside ruby brooches that seemed to hold fire in their depths. A tiara of pearls and sapphires lay wrapped in silk that had somehow survived the decades without decay. David lifted a necklace from its velvet bed, watching as the diamonds threw rainbow patterns across the stone walls. Each piece was a masterwork of craftsmanship, the kind of jewelry worn by queens and empresses. The inventory estimated the contents of this single chest at over $2 million, but David suspected that was a conservative figure. Chest after chest revealed treasures that grew more magnificent with each discovery. Religious artifacts crafted from precious metals and adorned with gems that had been cut by master jewelers centuries ago. Rare manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf and bound in leather that had been lovingly preserved. Communion vessels encrusted with diamonds and emeralds that caught the light like captured rainbows. But it was the seventh chest that truly took David's breath away. According to the inventory, it contained what Brother Marcus had described as the crown jewel of our collection, a donation from an anonymous benefactor who had wished only to ensure that God's work would continue in perpetuity. The chest was larger than the others, its iron bindings more elaborate, its lock more complex. When David finally managed to open it, he understood why it had required special protection. Inside, resting on a bed of the finest silk, was a golden chalice of breathtaking beauty. The cup itself was crafted from pure gold and decorated with scenes from the life of Christ. Each figure rendered with such delicate detail that they seemed to move in the dancing light. But it was the gems that made the chalice truly extraordinary. Rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds covered every available surface, each stone perfectly cut and set with a skill that spoke of master craftsmen working at the height of their abilities. The chalice seemed to glow with its own internal light, as if the devotion of centuries had been captured within its golden walls. David lifted the chalice with hands that trembled from more than excitement. The weight was substantial, but it was the sense of history that truly overwhelmed him. This wasn't just valuable art or precious metal. This was a sacred object, created by faithful hands to serve the glory of God and now resting in his calloused palms. As he carefully replaced the chalice in its silk bed, David noticed something else in the chest. A small leather pouch, worn soft with age, lay beside the golden cup. Inside the pouch was a collection of loose gems, each one the size of a marble and cut with precision that made them seem to burn with inner fire. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires that represented more wealth than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. What happens next will reveal the true scope of this incredible discovery, uncover the dangerous secrets that led to its concealment, and show how one man's faith in the impossible can transform not just his own life, but an entire community. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true tales. By the time David had opened half the chests, his mind was reeling from the sheer magnitude of what he'd discovered. The inventory's estimate of $18 million was clearly outdated, based on values from over a century ago. In today's market, considering the historical significance and craftsmanship of these pieces, the collection had to be worth far more. But numbers couldn't capture the true significance of what lay hidden beneath the monastery. This wasn't just treasure. This was history, preserved in gold and gems and precious artifacts that told the story of a community's faith and devotion. Each piece had been given with love, donated by families who believed their treasures would serve a greater purpose. David returned to the stone table where the inventory book waited. Now that he'd seen the treasure with his own eyes, the careful script took on new meaning. Brother Marcus hadn't just been recording donations. He'd been documenting the creation of something unprecedented, a treasure vault that represented the combined wealth and faith of dozens of families. Turning to the back of the book, David found sections he'd missed in his initial excitement. Here, Brother Marcus had recorded not just what was hidden, but why it needed to be concealed. The pages told a story that was part history lesson, part confession, and part warning for future generations. The year 1873 has brought troubles that test our faith, Brother Marcus had written, "The economic panic has destroyed fortunes and ruined families across the nation. But worse than financial hardship is the spiritual crisis that grips our region. Men who once gave freely to God's work now speak of taking what they believe the church has hoarded." David read on, fascinated by the monk's account of a time when anti-Catholic sentiment ran high and rumors spread that the monastery was hiding vast wealth while common people suffered. The truth, according to Brother Marcus, was more complex. The donations had indeed been substantial, but they came with specific instructions from the donors. The Morrison gold was given to establish a school for orphan children, David read. The Ashford jewelry was donated to fund a hospital for the poor. The anonymous chalice came with instructions that it be sold only in times of greatest need, when the church itself faced extinction. But the economic collapse of 1873 had made it impossible to fulfill these charitable intentions. Banks had failed, construction projects had been abandoned, and the monastery itself faced threats from angry mobs who believed the monks were living in luxury while their neighbors starved. Brother Marcus had made the decision to hide the treasury until calmer times allowed for its proper use. The chamber had been excavated in secret, with only a handful of trusted monks aware of its existence. The entrance had been sealed and disguised, and Brother Marcus had taken a vow to reveal the location only to his successor when the time was right. But Brother Marcus had died unexpectedly in 1874, struck down by the same influenza outbreak that claimed half the monastery's population. His successor, Brother Thomas, had no knowledge of the hidden treasury and assumed the missing donations had been spent before his arrival. Thus, Brother Marcus had written in his final entry, "I commit this record and these treasures to Providence, trusting that God will guide them to someone worthy when the need is great enough and the time is right." David closed the book, understanding finally that he wasn't just the accidental discoverer of forgotten treasure. He was the answer to a prayer that had been waiting over a century to be fulfilled. Brother Marcus had trusted that someday someone would find this chamber and understand the responsibility that came with its contents. Someone like a widowed father who had spent his last $3,000 on what everyone called a fool's dream. David spent the next hour methodically examining each chest, comparing its contents to the inventory, and trying to wrap his mind around the true scope of what he'd inherited. The gold alone was worth millions. The jewelry and artifacts represented art treasures that belonged in the world's finest museums. The religious items were priceless relics that spoke to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. But it was in the final chest that David made his most extraordinary discovery. Unlike the others, this container held not gold or jewels, but documents, carefully preserved maps, land deeds, and legal papers that told the story of how the treasury had been assembled and what it was meant to accomplish. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from moisture and decay, David found Brother Marcus's personal journal. The pages revealed a man of deep faith and practical wisdom who had understood that preserving wealth was meaningless unless it served a greater purpose. "I have spent these months in prayer," Brother Marcus had written, seeking guidance on how to protect not just these material gifts, but the intentions of those who gave them. Each coin, each jewel, each precious object represents a family's hope that their sacrifice would serve God's work in the world. The journal detailed Brother Marcus's plan for the treasury's eventual use. The monastery would become a center of learning and healing, with schools for children regardless of their family's ability to pay. The land around the building would be developed as a refuge for those in need, with gardens to feed the hungry and workshops to teach useful skills. "This treasure is not meant to enrich any individual," Brother Marcus had written, "but to serve as seed money for a harvest of hope that will feed souls as well as bodies." David read these words with growing understanding. The monk's vision was remarkably similar to the dreams Sarah had shared during their visits to the monastery. She had talked about turning the building into a community center, a place where families could gather and children could learn. Brother Marcus had seen the same potential over a century earlier. As David sat in the hidden chamber, surrounded by wealth beyond imagination, he felt a connection spanning generations. The monk who had preserved these treasures, the families who had donated them, and his beloved Sarah, who had believed the monastery could be more than a ruin, they were all part of the same vision. But the weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming. David was just a lumber mill worker who could barely make ends meet. What did he know about managing millions of dollars or fulfilling the charitable intentions of long-dead donors? How could he possibly be worthy of a trust that had been waiting over a century for the right guardian? The answer came to him as he sat in the silence of the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of faith that had endured through decades of darkness. He didn't have to be worthy. He just had to be faithful to the vision that had brought him here. Brother Marcus hadn't been a wealthy man when he'd accepted responsibility for the treasury. The families who had donated their treasures hadn't been certain their gifts would be used wisely. Sarah hadn't known if her dreams for the monastery would ever become reality. Faith wasn't about certainty. It was about taking the next step even when you couldn't see the whole staircase. David carefully closed the final chest and secured its lock. The treasures would be safe here for a few more days, while he figured out the legal and practical steps necessary to claim his inheritance properly. But already, his mind was spinning with possibilities that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. The medical bills that had haunted him since Sarah's death could be paid in full. His children could attend any college they chose, pursue any dream they dared to imagine. The family home could be restored, or they could build a new one, complete with the porch swing Sarah had always wanted, and the workshop where the boys could learn to work with their hands. But more than personal comfort, David now had the means to honor Sarah's memory in ways that would touch thousands of lives. The monastery could become the community center she'd envisioned, serving families throughout the region. The land around it could be developed as Brother Marcus had planned, with gardens and workshops and schools that would serve the poor and forgotten. The people who had mocked him for buying a crumbling monastery would soon discover that sometimes what looks like folly is actually faith taking its first brave step toward a miracle. As David prepared to leave the hidden chamber, he took one last look around at the treasure that would soon change everything. The golden chalice caught his eye, its jeweled surface reflecting the light in patterns that seemed to dance with joy. On impulse, he lifted the sacred cup from its chest and held it high, as if offering a toast to the unseen spirits who had guided him to this moment. "Thank you," he whispered to Brother Marcus, to the families who had donated their treasures, to Sarah, whose dreams had led him here, and to whatever divine providence had orchestrated this incredible discovery. "I won't let you down." The chalice seemed to glow brighter in response, as if blessing his promise and welcoming him into a fellowship of faith that stretched across centuries. David carefully returned the cup to its resting place and began his journey back to the surface, carrying with him the knowledge that his life and the lives of countless others would never be the same. Behind him, the treasury settled back into patient silence, its vigil nearly over after more than 100 years of waiting. The treasure had finally found its guardian, and the guardian had finally found his purpose. The monastery above no longer felt like a ruin to David. As he emerged from the hidden passage and walked through the nave where he and Sarah had once dreamed together, he could almost see the building as it would soon become, alive with laughter and learning, warm with community and compassion, glowing with the kind of hope that turns ordinary places into sanctuaries. David had entered the monastery that morning as a desperate man clinging to impossible dreams. He was leaving as the steward of a miracle that would echo through generations. The transformation had begun, not just for the building, but for the man who had dared to believe that broken things could be made beautiful again. The snow had stopped falling by the time David locked the monastery doors behind him. Through the break in the clouds, afternoon sunlight streamed across the valley, illuminating Cedar Falls with golden light that made everything look new and full of possibility. As he drove home to his children, David carried with him not just the secret of incredible wealth, but something far more precious, the certain knowledge that their story was just beginning. The treasure beneath the monastery had been waiting for him, and now, finally, it was time to put it to work. David spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the enormity of his discovery before he realized he couldn't handle this alone. The treasure beneath the monastery wasn't just a personal windfall that he could quietly manage from his kitchen table. This was a historical find of massive proportions that would require lawyers, appraisers, tax experts, and probably federal oversight. More importantly, it would require someone who understood how to turn millions of dollars into meaningful change without destroying the very community he hoped to help. On Thursday morning, David made the decision that would transform everything. He called Sarah Chen, editor of the Cedar Falls Gazette, the same woman who had written his wife's beautiful obituary 8 months earlier. If anyone could help him tell this story the right way, it would be someone who had known and respected Sarah. "David?" Sarah's voice carried surprise and genuine warmth. "How are you holding up? I heard you bought the old monastery." "Actually, Sarah, that's why I'm calling. I need to tell you something, but it has to be off the record until I figure out how to handle it properly." There was a pause. "You're scaring me a little. Is everything okay?" David looked out his kitchen window toward the monastery, its bell tower barely visible through the morning mist. "I found something up there. Something that's going to change everything." 2 hours later, Sarah Chen sat in David's living room, her notebook forgotten in her lap as she stared at the photographs he'd printed the night before. Images of gold coins catching flashlight beams, jewelry that belonged in royal collections, and religious artifacts that seemed to glow with their own inner light filled the coffee table between them. "David," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you understand what this means? Not just for you, but for the entire town." "I think I'm starting to," he replied. "That's why I called you. I need help figuring out how to do this right." Sarah picked up a photograph of the golden chalice, studying the intricate details that somehow survived the digital transfer. "This is going to be national news. International, probably. Are you ready for that kind of attention?" David thought about the reporters who would descend on Cedar Falls, the government officials who would want to examine every coin and document, the lawyers who would argue about ownership and taxes and historical significance. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for something like this. But hiding it isn't an option. What's your plan?" David pulled out a legal pad covered with notes he'd been making since discovering the treasury. "I've been thinking about what my wife would want me to do. Sarah always said the monastery should be a place that brings people together, that helps families and serves the community. Now I have the means to make that happen." He outlined his emerging vision. The Sarah Martinez Foundation, named after his wife, that would use the treasure to establish scholarships, fund community programs, and restore the monastery as a regional center for education and healing. Half the money would secure his children's future and pay off the crushing medical debt that had haunted him since his wife's death. The other half would be invested in making Cedar Falls the kind of place where families could thrive, regardless of their economic circumstances. Sarah Chen listened with growing amazement, taking notes as David described plans for a free medical clinic, after-school programs, job training workshops, and support systems for families dealing with illness or financial hardship. This wasn't the desperate dreaming of a man who had suddenly stumbled into wealth. This was the careful planning of someone who understood that great resources brought even greater responsibilities. "You realize this will make you the most important person in Cedar Falls history," Sarah said. "People are going to treat you very differently." David's jaw tightened. "They already treat me differently. Like I'm the crazy widower who wasted his last $3,000 on a pile of rocks. At least now I can prove them wrong." That afternoon, Sarah Chen worked with David to craft a press release that would announce the discovery while emphasizing his commitment to using the treasure responsibly. They agreed to break the story simultaneously in the Cedar Falls Gazette and 3 major newspapers, ensuring that David's version of events would be the first one people heard. The headline would read, "Local Father Discovers Historic Treasure, Plans Community Foundation in Wife's Memory." By Friday evening, advance copies of the story had been distributed to key figures around Cedar Falls. Mayor Patricia Vance called David personally, her voice trembling with excitement and barely concealed avarice. "David, honey, this is just incredible. We need to meet first thing Monday to discuss how the city can support your wonderful discovery." David remembered Mayor Vance's dismissive attitude just weeks earlier when she'd publicly questioned his poor judgment in buying the monastery. Now her voice dripped with the kind of fake sweetness that made his skin crawl. "I appreciate your interest, Mayor. But I've already retained legal counsel to help navigate the process properly." "Oh, well, of course, but surely the city should have some input on how this treasure affects our community planning." David hung up, knowing that Mayor Vance was already calculating how much tax revenue and tourist dollars the discovery might bring to Cedar Falls. She wasn't the first person that evening to suddenly develop an intense interest in his welfare. Bill Murphy from the diner called to apologize for doubting David's vision and to suggest that the new foundation might want to consider investing in local businesses. Henderson from the hardware store stopped by with a bottle of wine and hints that David might need a reliable contractor for the monastery restoration. Even David's supervisor at the lumber mill, who had been threatening to dock his pay for missed shifts, called to congratulate him and offer any assistance you might need during this exciting time. The most painful call came from his brother-in-law Marcus, Sarah's younger brother, who had barely spoken to David since the funeral. Marcus had openly criticized David's parenting and suggested that Emma and the twins might be better off with relatives who could provide stability. "Dave, buddy." Marcus's voice boomed through the phone with artificial enthusiasm. "I just heard the incredible news. Sarah would be so proud of what you're doing with that old place. Listen, I've been thinking about how I could help with the foundation. I've got experience in financial planning, and family should stick together during times like these." David listened to his brother-in-law's transparent attempt to position himself as an advisor to the new foundation, remembering every cutting comment Marcus had made about his fitness as a single father. When the call ended, David found himself feeling more isolated than ever. Sudden wealth, it seemed, had a way of revealing people's true motivations with uncomfortable clarity. The weekend brought a parade of visitors to David's modest house on Maple Street. Former classmates he hadn't spoken to in years showed up with casseroles and suggestions for investment opportunities. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now lingered at his fence, hoping for invitations to coffee and conversation about his amazing good fortune. Most disturbing were the people who approached Emma at her job at Patterson's grocery, pumping her for information about her father's plans and making suggestions about how the family should spend their new wealth. Emma came home Friday night with tears in her eyes and a stack of business cards from people who claimed they could help the Martinez family manage their transition to a new lifestyle. "Dad," she said, curling up on the couch beside him while the twins played video games in their room, "everyone at school is acting weird around me. Some kids are suddenly super friendly, and others are making comments about how we think we're better than everyone now." David pulled his daughter close, feeling the weight of changes he hadn't anticipated. "We're still the same people we were last week, Em. The only thing that's different is our ability to help others. But it doesn't feel the same," Emma whispered. "Even Mrs. Patterson is acting strange. She offered to give me more hours, then asked if I thought you'd consider investing in expanding the store." That night, after the children had gone to bed, David sat at his kitchen table surrounded by business cards, legal documents, and notes from Harold Brennan, the attorney he'd hired to navigate the complex legal issues surrounding his discovery. The phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, government officials, and people claiming to be distant relatives who had just learned about his good fortune. Brennan had warned him that claiming ownership of the treasure would require extensive documentation, tax payments that could consume a significant portion of the find, and ongoing legal battles with parties who might claim the Catholic Church or the federal government had better title to historically significant artifacts. The good news, Brennan had explained during their meeting in the state capitol, is that you legally own the property where the treasure was found. and there's no evidence that the artifacts were stolen or obtained illegally. The monastery donated the items to itself, essentially, which means they belong to whoever owns the monastery. What's the bad news? The bad news is that the IRS is going to treat this as taxable income, which means you'll owe millions in taxes. The State Historical Commission will want to examine everything and may designate certain items as too historically significant to sell. And once word gets out publicly, you're going to have every treasure hunter, lawsuit happy lawyer, and con artist in the country showing up at your door. Brennan had already begun the process of having the treasure professionally appraised and catalogued, working with experts who specialized in historical artifacts and religious art. Preliminary estimates suggested the collection was worth far more than Brother Marcus had calculated over a century ago. Some pieces were so rare and historically significant that major museums would compete to acquire them, driving values into eight-figure territory. The chalice alone, according to one preliminary assessment, could be worth $20 to $30 million due to its craftsmanship, historical provenance, and religious significance. The gold coins represented not just precious metal but historical artifacts from a crucial period in American economic development. The jewelry included pieces that had belonged to some of the wealthiest families in the region during the Gilded Age. Total estimated value, $277 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. David had spent his entire life worrying about hundreds of dollars, occasionally thousands. Now he was looking at financial statements with numbers that seemed to belong to corporations or small countries rather than a lumber mill worker from Cedar Falls. But with the enormous wealth came equally enormous responsibilities. David spent Sunday morning reading through Brother Marcus's journal again, focusing on the monk's vision for how the treasure should be used. The parallels between the monk's 19th-century plans and David's emerging foundation were remarkable, as if the same spirit that had guided Brother Marcus was now working through him. Both men had envisioned the monastery as a center for education and healing. Both understood that great wealth was meaningless unless it served those who needed help most. Both recognized that the treasure's true value lay not in its monetary worth, but in its potential to transform lives and build community. By Sunday evening, David had made several crucial decisions that would shape everything that followed. First, he would establish the Sarah Martinez Foundation as a permanent charitable organization, ensuring that the treasure's benefits would continue long after his death. Second, he would retain only enough money to secure his family's future and pay the enormous tax bills, dedicating the vast majority to charitable purposes. Third, he would insist on complete transparency in all foundation activities, publishing annual reports and maintaining public oversight of how the money was spent. Most importantly, he would move quickly to begin the monastery's transformation, not waiting for the legal complexities to be fully resolved before starting the work that mattered most. The building itself could be restored with his personal funds while the foundation's structure was being established, ensuring that the community would begin seeing benefits immediately. On Monday morning, David called a press conference at the monastery itself, inviting not just reporters but the entire population of Cedar Falls to hear his plans directly from him. Word had already leaked about the discovery, and rumors were spreading that grew wilder with each retelling. Some people claimed he'd found pirate treasure buried by Civil War deserters. Others insisted the government was covering up evidence of a crashed UFO. David wanted to set the record straight before the story spun completely out of control. The crowd that gathered in the monastery's nave that Monday morning included most of the town's population and reporters from media outlets across the region. Television news trucks lined the narrow road leading up to the monastery, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. David stood at the altar where he and Sarah had once dreamed about the building's potential, looking out at faces that showed every emotion from excitement to skepticism to barely disguised greed. Mayor Vance sat in the front row, flanked by city council members who were suddenly very interested in David's welfare. Behind them, were the neighbors who had mocked his purchase, the co-workers who had questioned his judgment, and the business owners who were already calculating how much tourist money the discovery might bring to Cedar Falls. But scattered throughout the crowd were other faces that gave David hope. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly supportive during his darkest days after Sarah's death. Old Mr. Henley, who had helped David load groceries into his truck when money was too tight for delivery. Young families struggling with the same financial pressures that had once crushed David's dreams. These were the people the foundation would serve. These were the lives that would be changed by Brother Marcus's century-old vision, finally becoming reality. "My name is David Martinez," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient nave. 8 months ago, I lost my wife Sarah to cancer. 3 weeks ago, I spent my last $3,000 buying this monastery because it was a place where Sarah and I had once dreamed about the future. He told the story simply, without drama or embellishment. The hidden passage, the underground chamber, the treasure that had waited over a century for someone to find it. He read excerpts from Brother Marcus's journal, explaining how the monastery's treasury had been assembled and why it had been hidden. He outlined his plans for the Sarah Martinez Foundation, detailing how the money would be used to establish scholarships, fund community programs, and transform Cedar Falls into a place where families could thrive, regardless of their economic circumstances. When he finished speaking, the crowd sat in stunned silence. Then Mrs. Patterson stood up, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and began to applaud. The sound echoed off the monastery's stone walls, growing stronger as others joined in, until the entire building rang with the kind of hope that had been missing from Cedar Falls for far too long. After the press conference, as reporters conducted interviews and neighbors examined the monastery with new eyes, David found himself surrounded by the same people who had mocked him just days earlier. But their tone had changed completely. "David, this is just incredible," gushed Henderson from the hardware store. "I always knew that old place had potential. Matter of fact, I remember telling my wife that buying it was a smart investment." Mayor Vance pushed through the crowd, her smile so bright it could have powered the town's streetlights. "David, honey, we simply must discuss how the city can support your wonderful foundation. I'm thinking tax incentives, zoning variances, maybe even naming a street after Sarah." Bill Murphy nodded enthusiastically. "I've been thinking about expanding the diner, maybe adding a banquet room for foundation events. You know, Sarah always said this town needed a place for celebrations." David listened to the sudden flood of support with mixed emotions. These people weren't wrong to be excited about the opportunities the foundation would bring to Cedar Falls. Property values would rise, new businesses would open, jobs would be created, and the town would finally have resources to address problems that had been ignored for decades. But their transparent attempts to position themselves as early supporters felt hollow after months of whispered criticisms and pitying looks. David understood human nature well enough to know that most people would support a winner, especially one who might benefit them financially. The challenge would be distinguishing between genuine offers of help and attempts to profit from his good fortune. As the crowd finally began to disperse, David found himself alone in the monastery for the first time since making his discovery public. The building felt different now, charged with possibility and purpose. Soon these ancient walls would ring with children's laughter. These stone floors would echo with the footsteps of students and families. These stained glass windows would illuminate dreams being born and hopes being fulfilled. The transformation had already begun, not just for the monastery, but for David himself. The desperate widower who had gambled his last $3,000 on an impossible dream was gone, replaced by a man with the resources and responsibility to change thousands of lives. The people of Cedar Falls would learn that sometimes what looks like folly is actually faith taking its first brave step toward a miracle. But first, David had to prove he was worthy of the trust that Brother Marcus had placed in an unknown future guardian over a century ago. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, David Martinez stood in what had once been the monastery's cold, empty nave. watching his 8-year-old twins Marcus and Samuel race through halls that now buzzed with life. The ancient stone walls echoed with sounds that would have made brother Marcus weep with joy. Children laughing as they worked on art projects, teenagers collaborating on science experiments, elderly residents sharing stories with anyone willing to listen. The Sarah Martinez Community Center had opened its doors just 3 weeks earlier, but already it felt like the beating heart of Cedar Falls. Where dust and silence had once reigned, warm light now spilled through restored stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across floors, where families gathered for everything from literacy classes to support groups for people dealing with illness and loss. Emma approached her father, clipboard in hand, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who had found her calling. At 17, she had transformed from a worried teenager forced to grow up too fast into a young woman who understood that great purpose could emerge from great pain. She wore a volunteer coordinator badge that she'd earned through months of dedicated work, establishing the center's youth programs. "Dad, the scholarship committee is ready for your input on the final applications," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that reminded David so much of Sarah. "We have 47 qualified candidates for the 15 full college scholarships, and honestly, they're all incredible." David smiled, remembering when Emma had worried they wouldn't have money for her own college applications. Now she was helping to select recipients for scholarships that would pay full tuition, room, and board at any university in the country. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter, who had once worked nights at the grocery store to help buy groceries, was now overseeing the distribution of educational opportunities worth millions of dollars. "What's your recommendation?" David asked, trusting Emma's judgment completely. Over the past months, she had proven herself to be not just smart and responsible, but wise beyond her years in understanding how to help people without destroying their dignity. "I think we should fund all 47, Emma said simply. "The foundation can afford it, and these kids represent the future of our entire region. Besides, Mom always said education was the one gift that could never be taken away." David nodded, feeling Sarah's presence so strongly it was almost physical. The foundation now controlled assets worth over $250 million after taxes and David's personal allocation, generating enough investment income to fund scholarships, community programs, and building maintenance in perpetuity. But more importantly, it was fulfilling Sarah's dream of making the monastery a place where broken things could be made whole again. The transformation had taken 6 months of careful planning, skilled craftsmanship, and more money than Cedar Falls had seen in its entire history. Master stonemasons had restored the exterior walls to their original Gothic splendor. Stained glass artisans had recreated windows that now told the story not just of religious devotion but of community resilience. The bell tower, silent for decades, now chimed every evening at sunset, calling people together and reminding them that hope could be heard as well as seen. But the real miracle wasn't in the restoration itself, it was in what the building had become. The main nave now served as a community hall, where town meetings, concerts, and celebrations brought together people who had lived as neighbors for years without really knowing each other. The former monastery cells had been converted into classrooms where children received free tutoring and adults learned job skills that could lift them out of poverty. The basement, once home to wine cellars, now housed a free medical clinic staffed by doctors and nurses who donated their time to serve families who had been without healthcare for years. The clinic had already treated over 300 patients, providing everything from routine checkups to complex procedures that would have bankrupted families just months earlier. Most remarkably, the hidden chamber where David had discovered the treasure had been transformed into a museum that told the story of Brother Marcus's vision, the families who had donated their wealth to serve God's work, and the patient faith that had preserved those gifts for over a century. Visitors could see selected artifacts from the treasury, read Brother Marcus's journal, and understand how one man's desperate gamble on a broken dream had unlocked blessings that touched thousands of lives. "Dad?" Marcus appeared at David's elbow, tugging on his jacket with the kind of urgent excitement that only 8-year-olds could generate. "Miss Rodriguez wants to know if you'll read to the little kids today. She says you do the best dragon voices." David looked down at his son, this bright boy, who no longer worried about whether there would be enough food for dinner or whether his father was falling apart from grief. The Popling twins attended the center's after-school program every day, surrounded by friends from across the economic spectrum and adults who helped them with homework, taught them new skills, and most importantly, believed in their potential. "Tell Miss Rodriguez I'll be there in 10 minutes, David said, ruffling Marcus's hair. "But first, I want to check on something." David made his way to the center's administrative offices, located in what had once been the monastery's library. Here, a small but dedicated staff managed the foundation's growing operations, scholarship programs, community outreach, building maintenance, and the delicate work of identifying families who needed help without making them feel like charity cases. The office buzzed with quiet efficiency as volunteers and paid staff coordinated programs that were already changing lives throughout the region. Phone calls came in daily from other small towns asking for advice on how to replicate Cedar Falls' transformation. Universities were sending researchers to study the foundation's innovative approach to community development. The monastery that everyone had written off as worthless was now being hailed as a model for rural revitalization. But for David, the most meaningful measurement of success wasn't in the headlines or academic studies. It was in the small moments that accumulated like snowflakes until they became an avalanche of hope. Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter receiving a full scholarship to medical school, old Mr. Henley's diabetes being properly managed for the first time in years, thanks to the free clinic. Families who had been struggling in isolation, discovering that they were part of a community that cared about their welfare. Sarah Chen from the newspaper had documented many of these transformations in a series of articles that had attracted national attention. But she'd also captured something more elusive, the way an entire town had rediscovered its sense of possibility. Property values had indeed risen, as David had predicted, but more importantly, civic engagement had flourished. Volunteer participation was at an all-time high. Local businesses were thriving as tourism increased and residents had more disposable income. Most remarkably, the population was growing for the first time in decades as young families chose to stay in Cedar Falls rather than moving to larger cities. The ripple effects extended far beyond the town limits. The foundation had established partnerships with universities to provide internships and research opportunities. Agricultural programs helped local farmers adopt sustainable practices that increased both productivity and profitability. Small business incubators provided loans and mentorship to entrepreneurs who created jobs and kept money circulating within the local economy. David's phone buzzed with a text from Harold Brennan, the attorney who had guided him through the complex legal maze of claiming and managing his inheritance. Final IRS review complete. Foundation status fully approved. Congratulations on building something remarkable. The legal battles had been intense, but ultimately successful. The federal government had indeed claimed some artifacts for national museums, but the compensation had been generous, and the foundation retained ownership of the most significant pieces. Tax obligations had consumed nearly $30 million, but the remaining wealth was more than enough to fund the foundation's mission for generations. More challenging had been the personal relationships that came with sudden prominence. David had learned to distinguish between people who genuinely wanted to help and those who saw the foundation as an opportunity for personal gain. Some relationships had been strengthened by shared purpose, others had been revealed as shallow when they couldn't survive the change in David's circumstances. But the most profound transformation had been in David himself. The broken man who had sat alone in the monastery 8 months earlier, overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty, had evolved into someone who understood that healing could only happen when it was shared. Working to ease others' burdens had somehow lightened his own. Building community had helped him find his place in the world again. "Mr. Martinez?" A young voice interrupted his thoughts. David turned to see Jessica Torres, a high school senior whose family had been struggling since her father's construction accident left him unable to work. Jessica had been accepted to 3 prestigious universities, but assumed college would be impossible due to financial constraints. Yesterday, she'd learned that the foundation would cover her entire education, including graduate school if she chose to pursue it. "I just wanted to thank you again," Jessica said, tears in her eyes. "My parents keep crying happy tears, and my little brother told his whole class that his sister is going to be a lawyer." David smiled, remembering his own children's dreams that had seemed impossible just months ago. "Your education is an investment in our entire community's future, Jessica. We're counting on you to come back and make Cedar Falls even better." As Jessica hurried off to join friends in the computer lab that had been funded by technology donations from grateful families, David reflected on how different this conversation was from the painful interactions with his own children just months earlier. Emma no longer worked at the grocery store because her father couldn't afford groceries. The twins no longer watched him carefully for signs that he was falling apart. They were all free to focus on growth, learning, and contributing to something larger than themselves. The changes in his children were perhaps the most miraculous aspect of the entire transformation. Emma had blossomed into a natural leader, organizing volunteer programs and coordinating with other charitable organizations across the region. She'd been accepted to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, but was considering taking a gap year to help establish satellite community centers in neighboring towns. Marcus and Samuel were thriving in ways that went beyond material comfort. They'd always been bright boys, but now they had access to educational opportunities, enrichment programs, and mentoring relationships that were developing their talents and confidence. More importantly, they were growing up understanding that privilege came with responsibility, that their good fortune was meant to be shared rather than hoarded. "Dad!" Samuel's voice echoed through the administrative offices as he burst through the door with his characteristic energy. "The dragon voices! Miss Rodriguez says the little kids are getting restless." David laughed, closing his laptop and preparing to fulfill his most important daily duty, reading stories to children whose parents were attending job training classes or support groups elsewhere in the building. It was a small task in the context of the Foundation's massive operations. But it was also the kind of personal connection that made all the money and publicity worthwhile. As he made his way to the children's area, David passed the memorial wall that had been installed near the main entrance. Sarah's photograph sat in the center, surrounded by images of Brother Marcus, the families who had originally donated the treasure, and community members who had contributed to the center's success. Below Sarah's picture, someone had inscribed her favorite quote, "Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions." The children's reading area buzzed with anticipation as David settled into the oversized chair that had become his regular spot for afternoon story time. 12 children between ages 4 and 8 gathered around him, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that reminded David why all of this effort was worthwhile. These kids came from families across the economic spectrum, brought together by parents who had found community and support within the center's walls. "Today," David announced, opening a book about a brave knight who discovered that the greatest treasures weren't gold or jewels. "We're going to read about someone who learned that the most important discoveries happen when you're trying to help others." As he began to read, using different voices for each character, and watching the children's eyes grow wide with imagination, David thought about the letter he'd found that morning from a teacher in Minnesota whose school district was implementing programs modeled after the Sarah Martinez Foundation's educational initiatives. The letter had included photographs of students who were thriving because someone in Cedar Falls had decided that broken things could be made whole again. The ripple effects were spreading far beyond what David had ever imagined possible, touching lives in communities he'd never visited and inspiring others to believe that transformation was always possible when faith was combined with action. Later that evening, after the center had closed and the last visitors had driven home through streets that now glowed with new streetlights funded by the foundation, David sat alone in the restored nave. The space felt peaceful in a way that honored both its religious history and its secular future. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting gentle patterns on floors that had witnessed centuries of prayer and now hosted community celebrations. Emma found him there, as she often did when the day's responsibilities were finally complete. She curled up in the pew beside him, comfortable in the silence that had become their tradition for processing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's challenges. The scholarship recipients want to establish a summer program for middle school students, Emma said eventually, something that combines academic enrichment with community service. They feel like they should give back even while they're still in college. David nodded, not surprised by the initiative. One of the foundation's unexpected successes had been its ability to inspire recipients to become contributors, creating a cycle of generosity that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. "What do you think about taking that gap year?" he asked, a question that had been weighing on his mind since Emma had first mentioned the possibility. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the vaulted ceiling where shadows danced in the moonlight. "I think Mom would want me to go to college," she said finally. "But I also think she'd understand if I felt called to do something else first. This place, what we're building here, it feels like the most important work I could be doing right now. You'll know when it's time," David said, remembering Sarah's voice saying the same words about decisions that seemed impossible to make. "Trust yourself to recognize the right path when you see it." As father and daughter sat together in the monastery where everything had changed, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 months earlier, he'd been a broken man clinging to impossible dreams and spending money he couldn't afford on property everyone else considered worthless. Tonight, he was surrounded by evidence that faith and persistence could indeed move mountains, or at least transform monasteries into beacons of hope. The treasure beneath the monastery had been extraordinary, but it wasn't the real miracle. The real miracle was what happened when people discovered that they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined, that their community was stronger than they'd dared to hope, and that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again when enough people cared enough to do the work. Brother Marcus's century-old vision had finally become reality, but in ways the monk could never have anticipated. The monastery was once again a place where the faithful gathered, but now faith was measured not in prayers, but in the willingness to believe that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together. David's phone buzzed with a message from Harold Brennan containing the final financial reports for the Foundation's first year of operation. The numbers were staggering. Over $8 million distributed in scholarships and community programs, hundreds of families served by the medical clinic, dozens of small businesses launched with foundation support, and a waiting list of communities asking for help establishing their own transformation initiatives. But the numbers that mattered most weren't in any financial report. They were in Marcus's confident smile as he helped younger children with their homework. They were in Emma's growing understanding that leadership meant service rather than privilege. They were in the voices of neighbors who gathered in the monastery's halls not as strangers sharing geographic proximity, but as community members invested in each other's success. As David and Emma finally prepared to leave the monastery for the evening, they paused at the memorial wall where Sarah's photograph seemed to glow in the gentle light. David touched the glass covering his wife's image, remembering her voice on their first visit to this place all those years ago. "It's not really abandoned. It's just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up. We did it, sweetheart," he whispered. "We woke it up." The drive home took them through streets that looked different now, not because of the new streetlights or the restored buildings, but because they were filled with the kind of hope that transforms ordinary places into sanctuaries. Children played in yards that had once been empty because families had moved away, seeking opportunity elsewhere. Porch lights glowed in windows of houses where elderly residents no longer lived in isolation because the community center provided transportation, social connections, and healthcare support. At his own house, David found the twins asleep in beds covered with homework that challenged rather than frustrated them, surrounded by books they'd chosen from the center's library rather than textbooks they couldn't afford. Their dreams were bigger now, their horizons broader, their futures brighter, because their father had been brave enough to believe that broken things could be beautiful again. That night, David sat at the kitchen table, where he'd once struggled to pay bills with money he didn't have, now reviewing applications for the Foundation's expanding scholarship program. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had once worried about $3,000 was now overseeing the distribution of millions, but the responsibility felt right in a way that mere wealth never could. On the table beside his laptop sat the brass key that had unlocked the monastery doors 8 months earlier. It had become his talisman, a reminder that sometimes the most important transformations begin with the smallest acts of faith. The key that had opened a crumbling monastery had ultimately unlocked possibilities that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls, touching lives in communities across the country and inspiring others to believe that their own broken things could be made whole. As David prepared for bed in a house that was finally warm and secure, he thought about tomorrow's challenges. A conference call with education officials from 3 states who wanted to replicate the Foundation's scholarship program, a site visit from architects planning a second community center in the neighboring county, and a meeting with Emma's guidance counselor to discuss her college options. But first would come his daily visit to the cemetery, where Sarah rested beneath a headstone that no longer represented the end of dreams, but the beginning of a legacy that would outlive them all. He would tell her about Jessica Torres's acceptance to law school, about the twins' science fair projects, about Emma's growing wisdom and confidence. He would thank her for the faith that had led them all to the monastery, where miracles waited patiently beneath ancient stones. David Martinez had entered that crumbling monastery as a desperate widower gambling his last hope on an impossible dream. He had emerged as proof that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning, and sometimes the most extraordinary treasures are discovered by ordinary people who refuse to stop believing in the possibility of transformation. The monastery bells would chime again at sunset tomorrow, calling the community together and reminding everyone who heard them that broken things could indeed be made whole again when faith was combined with persistence, when individual grief was transformed into collective healing, and when one man's desperate gamble became an entire town's miracle. Because for David Martinez and everyone whose life had been touched by his discovery, the real treasure had never been the gold and jewels hidden beneath the monastery floors. The real treasure was the understanding that hope could be inherited, faith could be shared, and love could echo through generations when it was invested in something larger than any individual life. The monastery that had once stood empty and forgotten now glowed with light that could be seen for miles, a beacon of possibility in a world that too often forgot that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they had the courage to believe in something bigger than their own limitations. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of faith, discovery, and the courage to believe in miracles. Click to continue your journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures are found by those brave enough to look past what everyone else calls worthless.